I'm willing to bet that there are some people who woke up this week and said, Tom Hanks has a daughter? Yes, he does, and my name's EA, and I'm very happy to be here. Well, originally I wanted to write a magazine story about the interstate through sort of the Southwest Texas and the Deep South and sort of the political landscapes of what's happening in those places. And while at the same time I was starting to really go through the facts of my childhood, and I was realizing that it had kind of set a course for my life. And I was trying to figure out, as I think we all do, how much am I responsible for the life I'm living, and how much does it come from kind of the playing cards you were dealt by your parents, by your genetics, by how you grew up. And as I was trying to sort of sort that out for myself, I discovered my mother's journals, and my mother was a deeply troubled lady who was very mysterious to me. I didn't know where she was born, I didn't know how she grew up, and she never, ever spoke about her father. And in these journals, I read her description of witnessing her father commit an absolutely hellacious crime. And I think as a daughter, I was horrified, and as a reporter, I knew I had found something that could set me out on the road and kind of give my drive a direction, which was to discover who was my mother and how did that in turn define who I am.
Did you tell your family beforehand that you were going to write this book? Was there anybody who was saying, maybe don't look so far into these this bin of papers?
Yeah, I think before I set out on this trip, the first thing I had to do was to talk to my father and brother. Not necessarily ask for permission, but certainly kind of test out the thickness of the ice. I think one of the things I had to confront really early on is that in telling my story, it was going to necessitate kind of swerving into their lanes, and that's not something you should do as a reporter to anyone without kind of a clarifying conversation. So I ran the idea by them, and then they were, both of them, my first readers. And the best thing that I can say is that they found it to be an accurate description of who my mother was in their experiences of her as well. To kind of encapsulate the differences in my life between Los Angeles and Sacramento, my life in Los Angeles was 3 square meals a day and dinner around the family table with a mom, a dad, 2 younger brothers, and usually 2 grandparents as well. And dinner at my mother's house was sometimes on a Wednesday night, it was a 7-course meal that she had been cooking all day long. And sometimes it was a dusty can of pate in the back of the pantry, or maybe we were going to Taco Bell for the 9th time in a week. So it was extremely bipolar. There were very high highs and very low lows. So, on one weekend I would be going to the Oscars with my dad to watch him win another Oscar back to back, and then I would go home and my teachers would have to send a report that I was clearly not being bathed regularly and didn't have clean clothes and no one was brushing my hair, and we won't even get into how long it was between dentist visits. So it was an incredibly kind of strangely surreal difference between the 2 cities.
Yeah, and I'd imagine going through that too must feel so isolating. Was there ever a time where you just felt like you were alone, or you were just trying to kind of understand this
right
at such a young age?
Growing up in these sort of circumstances, I think there was definitely a sense of sort of surviving a battle, but I had a common veteran in that war, and that was my older brother. And I certainly wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't be able to have written this book had not he been my sort of protector and witness. But I think something that anybody who's grown up around violence or the threat of violence understands, that when you experience that as a child, your instinct is not to go out and run for help. Your instinct is to cover up the shame and the secret. And that was really my job. I was my mom's lead protector. I stood between her and the world. There was no aspect of how I grew up that was sort of mysterious to my dad. He was well aware of what was going on. As readers of the book will see, there's a lot of history in this book about all the parts of America that the 10 covers. There was not quite enough room for the nuances of family law in California in the late 1980s, but which is to say that there was an extended legal sort of effort to get me out of my mother's house and away from these circumstances. But the kind of peculiarities meant that you needed receipts of physical violence, And up until then, there was really nothing we can do. But once my mother crossed that Rubicon is when, as I depict in the book, I moved to Los Angeles, which was bang in the middle of 7th grade when everybody's at their nicest. So the way that I grew up with my mom, very often it was the threat of violence rather than actual violence. She was an addict and she had the temper of an addict. And there was always the sense that you didn't want to hear mom coming down the stairs. And I think one of the reasons why I became a reporter is because I was so good at watching sort of her moods and being very attuned to her energy. Is she in a good mood? Is she in a bad mood? Do I need to make a joke to lighten the mood? Do I need to start another conversation? So it means you kind of always grow up at a distance from the person you're supposed to be closest with. And, you know, as a reporter, my first beat was my mom. And while she had been struggling with kind of her declining mental state, as mental health can get worse as you get older, you know, it was kind of incrementally getting worse and worse. And finally, when it became just, you know, fully violent, that is when I realized that even me, with my deep love that I had for her and true codependency that made me feel like I was supposed to be taking care of her, I think the sort of oasis vanished on the horizon, and I realized that I needed to take care of myself first. One of the sort of documents that sent me out onto the road with this mystery, including the sort of diary that includes the accusations about her father, was a bindery of my mother's poetry, which that I knew that she wrote, but I had never read. And when I went through it, I saw how much of it depicted the original road trip that she and I went on together in 1996. And I think anybody who's buried a parent recognizes that moment where the conversation becomes one-sided. And to read my mom's poetry and to include it in the book and to use my professional skills of, you know, working as a writer and editor for 20 years to put my, you know, bank of talent onto her work and to take her seriously as an artist was a way to enter back into conversation with her. And not only to be back in conversation with her, but to have that conversation be on her terms. And even though she wasn't there, it was the same sort of physical sense memory as there was when I got to be with my mom on a good day. And, you know, when she was alive, there were less and less good days. But now it feels like that's the mom I get to experience, at least in my sort of inner sense of our relationship.
Yeah, it's almost like you have stronger family ties now that you sort of demystified the past a little bit, being able to just sort of speak openly about what everybody knows and being able to walk in that truth rather than hide from it.
Well, I think an important aspect of when I did this trip was I did it 20 years after my mom died, far away from the immediate splash zone of grief. I think when you are mourning someone, that first year is a loss. And then like that 5 years is like you're learning how to be a human again and how to walk and talk. You're in serious emotional recovery. 20 years on allows for a lot more grace and a lot more understanding. I turned 37 when I was on this trip. I'm now 42 years old, and I feel like my mom passed when she was 49. And that realization and the truth that she did her best with what she had and she loved me the best that she could allows a lot more wiggle room for grace.
There's a few photos that you sent over that were so fun. One of them is a selfie of you and your dad on the set of Bridge of Spies.
Yes.
Do you enjoy going to set? Did you visit often?
I love being on set. I grew up on sets. To be the best part about being on set is a little bit like being here. You get to see that a lot of people go into making these things. A lot of talent, a lot of experience, a lot of unions, a lot of hours in the saddle. So growing up on set was not really about being around movie stars. It was really about the breakfast burritos. All of my best memories just across the board include burritos personally, because that's my value set and my culture. My favorite memories of set are, my dad's career is so varied that it can be being on a sound stage that has to be kept at sub-zero so you can see your breath, because in space it's so cold that you see astronauts breathing. So, that's the Apollo 13 experience versus, I'm in high school and we're going to move to Fiji, twice, one when he's fat and one's when he's thin, and living on an island where there's no roads and no cars, and there's just like golf carts and poisonous sea snakes everywhere. So that was for Castaway, by the way. Or learning to crab while living in South Carolina for a summer. It really was circus life, and it meant that I got to see talented people who make these movies all over the world, and it's one of the greatest privileges of my life.
I love the relationship that you have with your dad now. That you kind of chronicle it throughout the book, but it seems like the two of you are thick as thieves. You were at the 90-Second Wire last night on stage, having this very, very open and raw conversation in front of cameras,
yes,
in front of an audience. What was, I guess, the highlight of being able to share that story publicly with your father?
One of the highlights of being able to talk about the book with my dad before I wrote it, as I was writing it, and now as I'm bringing it out into the world, is that I get to invite him to kind of talk about it as two artists in discussion. I really enjoy spending time with my dad. We're kind of cut from the same cloth. It's a very shallow gene pool. You should not dive in head first. It's easy between the two of us. And I think that's hard earned, just having a lot of things in common can get you started, but intimacy really happens with hours in the saddle. And I think my dad and I have both really put in the work to be able to level with each other and enjoy each other's company. And one of the things we like to do most is talk about books, and I'm just lucky enough that he wanted to talk about mine.
What was the hardest part of having that conversation so publicly?
I think the hardest part about having that conversation publicly is that we couldn't dissolve into extremely private personal bits that no one would understand. We had to invite people into the world of the book and the world of the family that, most people don't know. I'm willing to bet that there are some people who woke up this week and said, Tom Hanks has a daughter? Yes, he does, and my name's EA, and I'm very happy to be here.
At the end of this experience of writing the book, doing the road trip, what did you learn about yourself, and what do you hope other people are going to be able to take away from this story?
Something that I learned from doing this trip and writing this book is that we should be a little bit more comfortable with mystery. You don't dive into a lake to immediately swim to shore. You enjoy being in the lake. And, I realized that all of this started because I thought to ask really basic questions about my mother. Where was she born? How did she live? Where did she go to high school? These were all mysteries to me. And I think the big takeaway is that you don't need a crazy mom, and you certainly don't need a famous dad to get curious about who you are and where you're from. And if you take the time to ask the people in your lives, your parents, your grandparents, an aunt or uncle, or even just your friend who you've known for forever, but maybe you don't know everything, that it will pay off in dividends to get curious and to just ask the basic questions, because you will stumble onto a surprise.